And thank you, Governor Northam and President Rao. It's really a great pleasure to be here with you today to talk to you about COVID-19 vaccines, our progress and priorities. I'm going to give a little bit of a background of why I feel it's so important for people to get vaccinated, particularly brown and Black people, because of the reasons that I'm going to be talking about in my presentation. And then I would obviously be happy to answer some questions afterwards. But let's take a look at the scope of the problem. As of yesterday, there are now close to 90 million cases of COVID-19 worldwide, with almost 2 million deaths. This now, as a global pandemic, is the worst that the world has seen in 102 years since the infamous pandemic of 1918. Unfortunately for us here in the United States, we are the worst hit country in the world, with over 20 million cases and close to 360,000 deaths. If one looks at this virtually every day, particularly now, as we're in the cold season where people do things indoors, where we're just coming off the travel and the congregating in social settings of the holiday season, virtually every day, another record is broke. Just yesterday, a record for deaths in a given day, 4,111 deaths occurred in the United States due to COVID-19. There were 280,000 new cases and over 150,000 hospitalizations. If one looks at the surges of cases, we can see that right now, on the right-hand part of the slide, in the late fall, the slope of the curve of increased cases on a daily basis show you that in the early spring, when the cases were dominated by the Northeast, particularly the metropolitan area of New York, then in early summer, as we try to open up the country because of the economic considerations, and then now, look how sharp that increase is, leading to the record numbers that I mentioned just a bit ago. One of the extraordinary aspects of this pandemic is the racial and ethnic disparities, with the most pervasive being observed in Black and brown people, African Americans, Latino and Latina, American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and Pacific Islanders. Now, one needs to look at why this is the case. There's what I call the binary nature of COVID-19 health disparities along racial and ethnic lines. There's an increased incidence of SARS-CoV-2 infection in minority populations, and there's a predisposition to severe disease once you get infected. So let's take a look at why is there an increased incidence. If one looks at in general, and there's always dangers to generalize, but here I think it's informative, because in general, when you look at the occupations and living conditions of Black and brown people, it often puts them in a situation out in the community, not generally having the opportunity to carry out their work looking at a computer screen the way I'm doing right now, but it often puts them in a position to have to interact outside in the community in a person-to-person way, which leads to the spread of a respiratory-borne illness. So point number one, there's an increased incidence of infection. Point number two, once infected, there's a predisposition to get severe COVID-19 disease. And why is that? It's because there's an increased incidence and prevalence of the comorbidities that are associated with severe COVID-19 disease that lead to the increased situation where you're more likely going to be seriously ill, hospitalized, intensive care, and death. So it's really what I would refer to the common colloquial language of a double whammy against Black and brown people. And the data show this to be true. Take a look at this, which is the rate of hospitalizations per 100,000 people, comparing Black, brown, Native Americans to white non-Hispanics. The extraordinary difference in hospitalizations per 100,000 people. Taking Black alone, 564 per 100,000 compared to whites, 184. When one looks at the deaths of these individuals, 132 per 100,000 compared to 81 among whites. Again, an extraordinary disparity for the reasons that I mentioned. Now, the NIH research on coronavirus is divided into multiple components: therapeutics, diagnostics, natural history, basic research. The one we're going to talk about today, importantly, is vaccines. And I'm going to tell you a little story about how this occurred and why we have the vaccines that we have right now. It has to do with the history of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease Vaccine Research Center. Way back, and Dr. Winn had mentioned during my years, which I still am very much involved with HIV/AIDS, in December of 1996, President Clinton and Vice President Gore invited me to the White House to discuss AIDS research. And here I am in the Oval Office discussing this with then President Bill Clinton. And in the discussion, he asked why we didn't have a vaccine. And I explained we really needed a vaccine research center where investigators from multiple disciplines, basic researchers, clinical researchers, people who understand immunology, virology, structural biology, could all work together. And to his great credit, he listened to me. And when he was giving a commencement address only 5 months later at Morgan State in Baltimore, he said, "Today I'm pleased to announce that the NIH will establish a new AIDS vaccine research center dedicated to this crusade." So what I did, I recruited from all over the country the very best people representing every single discipline that's important in the development of vaccines, from basic research to clinical trials. One of them is the person in the upper left-hand corner named Dr. Barney Graham. But he was interested in a bunch of other diseases. And because of the fact that they were so good at what they did, they began making vaccines for a variety of other diseases, including, as shown on this yellow highlight, coronaviruses, which is the virus that is now causing COVID-19. Now, there's Barney Graham now. I want people to understand that one of the important scientists who was a student of Dr. Graham, Kizzmekia or Kizzy Corbett, was one of the people involved in the development of a very important component of the Moderna, Pfizer, and other vaccines. And that is shown here on the right-hand side is that spike protein, which gives the virus on the left the light blue spikes sticking out, which gives it the appearance of a crown. And that's the reason why we call it coronavirus, because corona means crown. But it is an understanding how one can immunize people with that spike protein that allows us to have the successful vaccines we have now. We at NIH have taken a strategic approach by either developing, as I mentioned just a moment ago, or facilitating the testing of a group, 6 in number, of vaccines that we hope will ultimately be successful in protecting people against SARS-CoV-2. We did that through an organization called Operation Warp Speed, which is a collaboration between the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense. At HHS, it's NIH, my group, the CDC, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Agency, and the Assistant Secretary for Prevention and Response. And what we did is that we harmonized the protocols so that the endpoints were the same, the clinical trial units collaborated, the assays were the same, the people who judged The safety and the efficacy, which we called the Data and Safety Monitoring Board, was common, and the statistical plan was common. These are the vaccines that you're reading about in the newspapers every day. The ones that are the furthest advanced are the mRNA, done by Moderna and Pfizer, and I'll get back to that in a moment. The others are ones that are lined up now, and you'll hear about them soon, probably within the next couple of weeks. The Johnson & Johnson or Janssen, AstraZeneca, Novavax or Sanofi. The one that is out there now that we're vaccinating people with is the messenger RNA vaccine approach. People ask, mRNA, is this going to interfere with my genes? Absolutely not. What it is, it's an mRNA, which is a genetic component that codes for or instructs the body to make certain proteins. And in this case, the protein is that spike protein that you want the body to make an immune response against. So you inject someone with that in a very safe way. The body starts pumping out these proteins. Your immune system recognizes the protein, and you make a very nice immune response. And in fact, the two companies, Pfizer and Moderna, that are using this mRNA, which was tested in 30,000 people in the Moderna trial and 44,000 people in the Pfizer trial. And it was shown to be safe and extraordinarily effective, 94 to 95% to protect you against any form of clinical disease, and almost 100% in protecting you against severe disease. Now the vaccine needs to be distributed, and that's exactly what we're doing now. There have been some bumps in the road on the way, but we can talk about that during the question period. But the distribution is according to priorities. The phase one are healthcare personnel and those in long-term care facilities, namely nursing homes. Then frontline essential workers, and then the elderly, people 75 years of age or older. Then individuals who are somewhat younger but still within the elderly group, and those with high-risk conditions and other essential workers. We hope by the time we get to April, we'll be able to have what we call open season, namely anybody, even if you're not in a priority group, can wind up getting vaccinated, hopefully even sooner than that. Now, one of the things we want to mention is that there's a degree of skepticism, understandable skepticism, among the brown and black community, because history tells us they have not always been treated fairly and ethically by the federal government in their medical approaches. That's the past, a shameful past that we have to live with. But there are now safeguards in place that will never let that happen again. So you see on this chart how many among brown and black people are skeptical about the vaccine. And that's the reason why I and my colleagues are out there to talk about the process of how this is clearly a safe and effective vaccine, which I have enough confidence in that I myself, as some of you may know, was vaccinated publicly to show the case. And here is soon to be President Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, soon to be Vice President, being vaccinated. And there I am in the middle panel getting vaccinated at NIH about a week and a half ago, together with Francis Collins, the director of NIH, and HH Secretary Alex Azar. Now, I want to close by making one comment. We want you all to get vaccinated for your own protection, for that of your family, and for your community. However, we must remember that this is not a substitute, because until we get the overwhelming majority of the population in this country, and I would say 70 to 85%, to get good herd immunity, there still will be the danger lurking in the community about transmitting viruses. And for that reason, we need to continue to adhere to public health measures until we get this outbreak completely crushed, which I believe is entirely feasible in the context of 2021, likely towards the end of the year, but I believe strongly that we can do it. And finally, for those of you wanting more information about the vaccine and about how you might actually volunteer for other vaccine trials, you can just go to this link, coronaviruspreventionnetwork.org. But if you want to find out about the vaccine that's available, easy to do, just go to the CDC website, cdc.gov. So I'll stop there and be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci. Yeah, that was actually wonderful. You can't see it, but the number of amens just popped up on the screen and on my cell phone. So I just want to let you know that you got a lot of amens out there. We do have one question just to kick things off. And this question is really directed at you specifically. It says, how are you taking care of yourself, given that you've been under unremitting stress for the past 12 months? It says, do you need a couple prayers?
Well, I tell you, I need a lot of prayers. So if you got some to spare, send them on my behalf, please. No, actually, this has been an extraordinary year. I really, literally, without hyperbole, haven't had a day off since last January. So it's been a year, but it's important. I don't mean anybody to feel sorry for me. It's an important thing. We have so much at stake, which the health and the life and the safety of the American public, that until we get this really under control, then I'm not going to rest, and I promise you that. What I do is I try as best as I can to get, I don't get enough rest, but I exercise. So I think running has been my savior. I'm a former marathon runner, a former 10K runner. So right now I use that to relieve the stress of this job. But I wouldn't mind some prayers along the way. So please go ahead and do it.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, what specific steps do you believe churches or other houses of worship in general can and should take to promote vaccines and otherwise help stop the spread of COVID? And one follow-up to that was, do you think it would be wise or helpful if some of these houses of worship were partnered in a way in which they could even open up their churches to help deliver some of the vaccines?
Yeah, those are two great questions. Well, what we need to do, and this is absolutely critical, if we want to crush this outbreak, we've got to get the overwhelming majority of the United States population to get vaccinated, including, and I might say, even specifically Black and brown people, because of the risk that I showed you on some of those slides. And that was the reason I showed those slides, because of the increased risk of infection and serious deleterious consequences. So what Black churches, places of faith in Black and brown areas should do, since you do have an air of authority, you are trusted. You are trusted so much more than the outside non-brown Black world. So when you get up there and say to your brethren and your brothers and sisters who come to your churches that it's important for you to get vaccinated, that means an awful lot. And they will say, well, we have skepticism about that. And you ask, well, what is the issue? Well, we think it went too fast. And I think, as the governor said, and you may have said, Rob, that speed was related to extraordinarily breathtaking scientific advances in vaccine platform technologies that allowed us to do in months what normally would have taken years. So the next question people ask is, well, is it really safe and effective? I don't really trust the government. They may be just trying to put something over on us, and the drug companies are just trying to make a lot of money. So why should I trust them? Well, there's an answer to that skepticism. And that is that the decision as to whether or not this is a safe and effective vaccine was made by an independent body that is beholden not to the government, not to the company, but to the American public. It's called the Data and Safety Monitoring Board. And they decided that the data was striking, 94 and 95% efficacious in preventing clinical disease. The FDA makes the final decision as to whether it's safe and effective enough to go out to the general public. And here again, career scientists, not politicians, they together with a totally independent advisory committee then makes the recommendation whether the vaccine should go out to the general public. And they made that recommendation. So when you get up there in the church and talk to your brethren, you should be saying that the process was both independent and transparent. And that's the reason why you need to get vaccinated.
Thank you for that. We have one other question that just came in about how confident are you that this vaccine will be effective given the news that we hear from the United Kingdom and England about countering the new variants?
That's a very good question that a lot of people are asking. And right now, the scientists in the UK have taken a close look at this and have determined that the antibodies that are induced by the vaccine that we're using now are still very effective against the mutant strain. We will also be looking at that very carefully and following it carefully. And if anything changes, then we will be able to make a modification in the vaccine. But right now, the data indicate that the UK mutant is still quite sensitive to the antibodies that are induced by the vaccine. But again, we're going to be very careful. We're going to continue to follow that to make sure that it stays that way.
Got it. We have a great question about, given the fact that you've shown yourself and others who've taken the vaccine, what side effects did you have, and what side effects could you tell people to tell their congregation or people in the community to potentially expect?
Okay, so the side effects of the vaccine in the first dose are generally mild and the typical kind of side effects you get when you get a flu shot or any other of the shots that you get. You get a little bit an ache in the arm, which I got. It lasted about, first of all, I didn't feel it until maybe 6 to 10 hours after. I got vaccinated in the morning, and before I went to bed, I felt a little ache in my arm, but not enough to interfere with my going to sleep. I woke up in the morning, it was still there. By the next morning, it was gone. I didn't get any aches or chills or fever, but some people do. Now, I'm going to be getting my booster shot on the 19th of January, and I will likely get a little bit more of a ache and maybe a little bit feeling kind of down and fatigued, but it almost never lasts more than 24 hours. The incidence of severe side effects is very rare. There have been some allergic anaphylactic reactions to the tune of about 11 per 1 million people that get the vaccine, and it almost exclusively is in individuals who have a history of a strong allergic reactions. When you do have that history, it's a good idea to, if you take your vaccine, take it in a place where they can respond to and give you medication for an allergic reaction in case you're one of those 11 out of a million who get it.
Thank you for that. Another question is, this is a great question. Under what category are clergy considered? Are we considered essential workers, healthcare workers? Some of our activities, we make many visits to the hospital and assisted living centers. So Dr. Fauci, what's your opinion on clergy in the category that they're considered?
You know, I have to be really careful of giving you my opinion because it can become a soundbite really quickly.
We won't do that then.
So, you know, I don't know what category they're in now. When they looked at people as examples of essential personnel, you know, I don't know what the category of clergy is. So in all honesty, which I have been throughout this, I would have to get back to you, Rob, on that, really.
Thank you so much. And you got a couple amens on that one as well. So I just want, there's been a whole litany of amens coming your way. There is a question. This is from community folk, Community Clovia and others who say, we have folks who are coming, sometimes who are part of the justice systems, who are in reentry programs. How do you, what is the current recommendations as these people are going to things like halfway houses and other things like that of keeping these folks safe? Are there guidelines?
About vaccines, you mean? About keeping them? Yeah. They should be treated like any other citizen. Namely, if they fall into a category that they are in one of those priority groups, they should fall into that same category. If they're elderly, if they have underlying conditions, those are the kind of things that put you in the higher priority. But then once you get to what I call open season, they should have vaccine available to them as well as anybody else in society.
Got it. Thank you. We just got a bunch of text that sort of says that we should order a state full of masks, nation full of masks that says Team Fauci. But I think that there will probably be other epidemiologists you'd want them to sort of put out there too. Here's a question. This one is about literally for you, sir. How have you maintained your hope after so much misinformation, disinformation has challenged science? So how do you move forward in the context of being able to gain trust in the context of the vaccine?
Well, you're absolutely correct in what you're implying. Whenever there's mixed message and even distortion of the truth, it makes it very difficult to get a unified message across to people that they'd feel confident in, because they could always say, well, I've heard something else. So what you try to do, I try to do it. And that's the reason why I try to be out there as much as I can to tell people information that's based on solid scientific data and evidence. Well, one of the real problems that is so evident, it was so evident yesterday, the day before, with the horrible affairs that happened in my city of Washington, D.C. And I'm referring to the divisiveness in our society. We are really a very divided group. And what's happened in the public health is that it's assumed a degree of politicization. Like, it's a political statement whether you wear a mask or not. It's a political statement as to whether or not you believe this is real or it's a hoax. Well, it's certainly not a hoax. It's very real. The numbers that I've showed you are stunning numbers. Thousands of people a day dying, hundreds of thousands of people getting infected every day. But in answer to your question, you try as best as you can to consistently give a message based on solid scientific data and evidence.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from that says, are there specific or different COVID risks or guidelines for individuals with disabilities?
Well, it depends on really what the disability is. I mean, there are people whose disability includes some of the underlying conditions that make it very, very risky if you get infected. Namely, you have a much higher incidence of getting serious disease that could lead to a severe outcome, including death. And that is, anything from diabetes to obesity to hypertension to a variety of other conditions like heart disease and kidney disease. So if a disability is one that relates to an underlying illness, you really need to be very careful. And those are the kind of people that you almost want to seclude right now when we have so many infections going around, to protect them by keeping them isolated and not in contact with people that might be infected. Number one. Number two, those are the kind of people you want to make sure you get vaccinated right away.
Yes, sir. And as a follow-up to that, this is from one of the clergy, are we doing any studies on the safety of the vaccines for pregnant individuals?
It's a great question. The answer is that whenever you have a vaccine that's a new vaccine, you need to prove that it's safe and that it's effective in adult, non-pregnant, non-children, because children and adults are vulnerable. And you want to make sure you're dealing with something that you know works and that you know is safe before you give it to someone who's a vulnerable individual. And children and pregnant women are. So, and I say vulnerable, I mean, first of all, children can't give informed consent. So that's one of the things. You better be careful when you do something to a child that you do it and you're pretty sure. So what happens when you get a vaccine that has been proven to be safe and effective? Then you do a phase 1 careful safety study and immunogenicity, which means you want to see if it induces the same kind of response that you know works and is effective in a normal adult population. Once you show that, you can then make an extrapolation that in these children and in these pregnant women, it's good enough to give to them because it is very likely that it will be effective, because you A, have just shown it's safe, and B, you've just shown that it induces the same kind of response in the children and in the pregnant women that is protective in people who've gone through a true efficacy trial.
Thank you. And I know we're being very respectful of your time, but I have 2 questions. And one says, this is from one of our other presidents down the street, Dr. Crutcher, who's president of University of Richmond, says, when will we be able to resume normal human interactions?
Okay, well, that's dependent on us, Rob, because if we get the overwhelming majority of the population, and I would estimate, based on our experience with measles, that should be somewhere between 70 and 85% to get what we call herd immunity, where the virus doesn't have any room to go anywhere because most everybody, but not everybody, but most everybody is protected. If we roll out vaccines and we're successful in convincing the overwhelming majority of people to get vaccinated, logistically, that would likely take us sometime towards the end of the summer. So let's say we start getting through the priority groups in February, March, April. April, we start open season. Anybody can get vaccinated. And we vaccinate effectively and efficiently in May, June, July, August. I believe by the time we get to the fall, and it's a big if that you have to underline, if we get that overwhelming majority of people vaccinated, I think we could start approaching a reasonable degree of normality towards the mid-fall of 2021.
Thank you. And another quick question, and I think this is one that a number of people have been asking. What happens, there's news that there may be that 1 dose of the Moderna or 1 dose of the Pfizer vaccine is enough. This question says specifically, if we are giving this out in the community, how important is the 2nd dose?
Yeah, the 2nd dose is absolutely critical. That 1 dose of Moderna and 1 dose of Pfizer has not been proven to be efficacious to the degree that we want, and we don't know how long the protection lasts. So whatever you're hearing, 1 dose of the Moderna or 1 dose of the Pfizer is not optimal. Optimal is 1 dose of Pfizer followed in 21 days by the boost, or 1 dose of Moderna followed in 28 days with the boost, if you want optimal protection and optimal durability.
Thank you. And here's a quick question. I know that, again, I know 4 o'clock, but this is the last question, I promise, because I know you have to go. But again, thinking about as a cancer center director, but also as a broadly speaking sort of person that wants community health, what advice or what impact do you see COVID having on other diseases? For example, cancer, cardiovascular disease, these other things. Are you, from your vantage point, are looking at, or are you seeing the other negative potential impacts that COVID's having on those, or yeah, that's the question.
It's a great question, Rob, and we're putting a lot of effort in looking at post-acute COVID syndromes. In other words, what happens to people who have persistence of symptoms? Is that a clue to later on seeing organ system involvement that was not part of the original disease? We are so young in this disease in that we've only been dealing with it for less than a year, that we do not have a real grasp on what the effects might be in some of the diseases that you deal with and some of the diseases that I deal with. We just have to follow patients carefully. And if they get anything that looks like a post-COVID type involvement, we need to follow that carefully.
Thank you, sir. We certainly, and we know it's at the top of the hour for you. We obviously welcome you to stay for the panel. We know you are, very busy. I want to personally thank you. You don't know the number of texts and things that are coming through the chats that wish you well. People are praying for you all over. If you were at a regular Facts Faith Friday call, you would hear the amens in real time. But we want to thank you for the valuable information. We're hoping that at some point, I know you're incredibly busy, that maybe we can even get an update or at least a check-in with you at some point down the line. But we want to say thank you so much from Pastor Gray, for Sister Rudine, the Facts Faith Friday, from the governor's office, the University of VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, the Massey Cancer Center. I personally just want to say thank you. And I do want to call you out and sort of say, I have had the honor of recognizing that someone in my lifetime, when we talk about integrity, I talk to young residents, young faculty about integrity. I want to tell you and everybody else that I have admired your integrity and your ability to, even in the toughest times, to stay committed to the truth and to speak the truth. And so thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winn. I really appreciate those kind words. And thank you for all you do. It's been a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir.